15. Spanish-American War. The declaration of war against Spain, adopted by Congress on April 20, 1898, can be attributed to a variety of real and imaginary factors. Among the real considerations were American sympathy for the Cuban revolutionaries waging war against their colonial oppressors, 1868 through 1878, sugar interests in Cuba, and outrage over the tactics of General Valeriano Butcher Weyler and his concentration camps. Among the imaginary subjects were all of the propaganda targets of William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. The sinking of the battleship USS Maine in Havana Harbor on February 15th set the wheels in motion for a culmination of declared war 2 months later. The formal resolution adopted by Congress 1. Recognized the independence of Cuba, 2. Demanded the withdrawal of the Spanish armed forces from that island, 3. Authorized the President to utilize the Army and Navy to carry out this policy, and 4. Disclaimed any American interest in controlling Cuba or its people. The United States entered the hostilities with a modern steel navy of 2,000 officers and 24,000 enlisted men. The Army, by contrast, consisted of an ill-equipped 2,100 officers and 28,000 enlistees. Colonel Arthur L. Wagner, chief of the Military Information Division, counseled the President and the Cabinet against an immediate invasion of Cuba for reasons of weather and disease control. His advice won him the enmity of his overlord, Secretary of War Russell A. Alger, cost him his job, and caused him to be denied a promotion in rank until he lay on his deathbed. There were, however, a number of successful intelligence operations carried out during the war. Among the first of these was a mission by Lieutenant Andrew S. Rowan, a former military attaché in Chile and once in charge of the Military Information Division's map section, who, at the request of the President, was directed to carry a series of questions to the elusive rebel leader Calixto Garcia somewhere in Cuba. After finding Garcia, Rowan was to determine, quote, the numbers, location, and morale of the Spanish troops, the character of their officers, the topography, the condition of the roads in all seasons, how well each side was armed, and what the insurrectos were most in need of until an American force could be mobilized, end quote. To his great credit and the gratitude of the War Department, Rowan completed the mission, popularly captioned A Message to Garcia. A series of similar missions were carried out by Lieutenant Victor Blue, the executive officer of the gunboat Suwannee at the time of the undertaking. The first venture Blue made into enemy territory was prompted by a need to know where a shipment of arms, ammunition, and provisions under escort by the Suwannee and destined for guerrilla forces was to be landed. A second mission came at the urging of Admiral William T. Sampson, commander of the Caribbean Fleet, who, having blocked Santiago Harbor, wanted to determine how much of the Spanish fleet lay at anchor within the port. Blue was required to make a deep penetration of long duration into the Cuban countryside, much of which afforded him little protection from detection by patrols. In a third trip, Blue returned to observe Santiago Harbor for purposes of informing Sampson of channel obstructions, port defenses, and ship positions relative to an attack on the facility. An unusual officer of demonstrated abilities, Blue advanced quickly in rank. By the end of World War I, he was a rear admiral, served as Chief of Staff of the Pacific Fleet, and was Chief of the Bureau of Navigation. Retired in 1919, he died in 1928. A secret agent using the name Fernandez del Campo was dispatched to Spain by the War Department during the hostilities of 1898. Footnote: the actual identity of this agent supposedly has never been disclosed, but the source discussing his activities has suggested that he might have been Lieutenant Colonel Aristides Moreno, an American intelligence officer of Spanish descent who was in charge of counter-espionage matters on General John J. Pershing's staff in France during World War I. See Rowan and Deindorfer, page 719. End footnote. Quote, stopping at the capital's best hotel, He made no advances and presented no letters of introduction, but let his dislike of the Yankees be understood and gave it out that his visit to Madrid must be brief. Members of fashionable clubs, military officers, and officials of the government met him, accepted his casual invitations, were sumptuously entertained, and also enriched by one who lost money at cards with the insouciance of inherited manners and income." End quote. The man carefully and cleverly maneuvered himself into favor with Spanish officials and naval personnel, was shown the armaments, munitions, and stores of their fleet, observed the Cadiz dockyards and arsenal, and learned both the departure date and destination of the Armada, the last item being the purpose of his mission. Admiral George Dewey and his forces around the Philippine Islands were alerted that they were the target of this Spanish flotilla, and the spy returned safely to the United States for private honors. The Signal Corps was an established entity within the Army when the declaration of war against Spain was ratified. At the time, the unit's duties were, quote, "to establish and maintain intercommunication between the territorial components of the nation by submarine or overland telegraph and telephone with its armies in the field, wherever they may be located, between the subdivisions of its armies, in camp, in campaign, and in battle, by visual signals and by flying or semi-permanent telegraph and telephone lines, and the gathering of such valuable military information as its command of the channels of communication may make possible." As its duties indicate, its work embraces the construction and operation of all military telegraph and telephone lines, the manipulation of submarine cables, the operation of captive balloons, visual signaling, and telegraph censorship. End quote. Immediately prior to entering the war, the Signal Corps consisted of approximately 8 officers and 50 enlisted men. This was quickly expanded to about 150 personnel, pending the organization of a volunteer corps. Congressional approval for a volunteer Signal Corps occurred in May 1898, and the regular ranks of the unit eventually reached 1,300 men. The Signal Corps performed important intelligence service in 3 instances during the Spanish-American War. The first of these exploits involved severing the submarine cables serving Cuba, thereby isolating the island for purposes of communication, and utilizing the detached lines at other terminals beyond the island for our own purposes. In 1898, 5 submarine cables connected Cuba with the continents. 2 ran between Havana and Punta Rasa, Florida. 1 connected Santiago with Haiti and thence to New York or to South America, and 2 linked Santiago with Kingston, Jamaica, where 1 line continued on to the Bahamas and Halifax, and the other skirted the coast of South America to Pernambuco and ran on to the Canary Islands and then to Lisbon. The Florida cables presented no problem, as the United States controlled the terminals and allowed some communications of a supposedly non-military nature to flow between Cuba and Florida. Quote, "To Colonel James Allen, United States Volunteer Signal Corps, was entrusted the task of severing Cuba telegraphically from Spain and rearranging the cables for American use. The ship Adria was immediately chartered in New York, and the cable machinery of the Mexican Telegraph Company secured and installed in the ship, which proceeded to Boston and took on 24 miles of deep-sea cable furnished by the Western Union Company, and then returning to New York, took on 29 miles of intermediate-type cable and 50 miles of insulated but unarmored wire with instruments and supplies, and proceeded to Key West without having attracted the attention of the press." End quote. After a great deal of difficulty with the ship's crew and his own technicians assigned to the mission, Allen could recruit only 3 signal sergeants, a detail of 10 artillery volunteers from the garrison at Key West Barracks, an assisting Signal Corps officer, and a motley ship's crew. Of those under this direct command, only 1 had been to sea previously, and none of them had ever seen a submarine cable. The Adria arrived off the coast of Santiago on the afternoon of June 1st and began dragging for the cable within the 3-mile limit, which was well within the range of Spanish shore batteries. This proximity was necessary because, the cables not being the property of Spain, they could legally be severed only within the jurisdiction of the nations at war, i.e., within 3 miles of the coast of their territory. This position also contributed technical difficulties to the mission, as submarine cable was armor-plated where it became subject to coastal tides, currents, and frictional contact with the ocean bottom. The Adria's machinery for lifting the cable almost proved impossible for the task. The cable was snared and lost, relocated, and finally surfaced by straining hoists and coughing motor pulleys. The Adria was fired on by shore batteries a few times, but the mission was finally completed. Allen and his group also assisted in making the cable between Santiago and Haiti operational for United States forces after it was severed by a party aboard the St. Louis. These actions not only isolated the Spanish forces on Cuba from ready communication with points beyond the island, but gave the United States almost total control of cable communication around the theater of war. Another important accomplishment of the Signal Corps was the reporting of the arrival of Admiral Pascual Cervera y Topit's squadron at Santiago within 2 hours after it entered the harbor. While the Spanish fleet was known to have departed for the Caribbean, its mission was unknown. Would it attack the United States coast? Would it immediately engage in a sea battle with American ships blockading Cuba? Would it attempt to refuel and drop supplies at a Cuban port? And what harbor would it utilize? Even the Army was afraid to dispatch troops to Cuba for fear of having these forces caught in transports by the unlocated Spanish flotilla. On May 19th, after eluding the blockading American forces, Cervera, unobserved on the open sea, entered Santiago harbor. 1 hour after the fleet made port, details about its arrival and composition were dispatched to Washington from Key West by Colonel James Allen. Quote, "No confidence is violated in now telling that the information regarding Cervera's squadron came to Colonel Allen through an employee of the cable company at Havana, who was in the pay of the Signal Corps. All the information about Cervera came from Santiago over the Cuba submarine cable on the south coast to the Captain General at Havana, and Colonel Allen's agent obtained it from, quote, a Spanish government official holding a high position," end quote. 10 days after its arrival, the Spanish fleet came under blockade in the harbor when ships under Admiral Sampson arrived off Santiago. The situation remained static until July 3rd, when Cervera attempted to make a dash for the sea. In a 4-hour battle along the Cuban coast, the Spanish ships succumbed to superior American firepower. The fleet was destroyed. 474 Spanish seamen were killed, and another 1,750 were taken prisoner. American forces counted 1 dead and 1 wounded. On July 17th, the Santiago garrison surrendered, resulting in another 24,000 prisoners. The destruction of the Spanish fleet marked the virtual end of the war. The Signal Corps' third intelligence effort derived from its mission of communications control and duty as censor, quote, whose purpose was not to restrict the press or to muzzle the people, but to thwart treason and to prevent news of military and naval operations from reaching Spanish territory to the injury of the American cause, end quote. Quote, the lines constructively seized by the Signal Corps at the order of the President embraced the landlines of Florida, the 7 submarine cables to foreign countries having their termini in New York City, the French cable on the south coast of Cuba, the English cables in Puerto Rico and Santiago, and the Cuba submarine cables, end quote. The Signal Corps did not actually displace any personnel operating these lines, but instead assumed supervision of operators and messages in each case. The signal officer attached to each station assumed some responsibilities as a censor, while the chief signal officer held final authority on such questions. Not all communication was prohibited over these cables, and, in fact, a certain amount of intelligence derived from allowing personal and commercial traffic. Quote, all telegrams in Spanish to and from Spain, Cuba, Haiti, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and St. Thomas were prohibited, as well as all messages in cipher to any foreign country, except that the right to communicate in cipher was allowed the legal, diplomatic, and consular representatives of neutral foreign governments. Personal and commercial messages in plain text were admitted when deemed advisable and when not containing military information, as it was the purpose of the chief signal officer to exercise the necessary military censorship with the least possible inconvenience to legitimate commercial business. Thus it happened that throughout the war, messages pertaining to domestic or commercial affairs were passed freely over the lines to Havana and even to Santiago. Much information of inestimable value was gleaned from a perusal of messages which were attempted to be passed by Spanish agents, blockade runners, newspaper correspondents, and unfriendly or neutral persons. The movements of Spanish ships, the plans of blockade runners, and the presence and doings of Spanish agents were thus discovered and watched. By accepting messages of treasonable character and quietly dropping them in the wastebasket, the sources of the information were not alarmed and repeatedly furnished to the United States valuable intelligence." End quote. The first efforts at establishing peace were made through the French ambassador at Washington shortly after the defeat of the Cervera Squadron. A protocol signed on August 12th provided for a peace treaty to be concluded in Paris and halted hostilities under the terms that 1. Spain was to relinquish Cuba and cede Puerto Rico and one of the Ladrone Islands to the United States. 2. American forces were to continue to hold Manila, and 3. Occupation of Manila would continue until a peace treaty was concluded determining the disposition and control of the Philippine Islands. The Paris Treaty was finalized on December 10th, ceding the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam to the United States, calling for a payment of $20 million for the Philippines and effectively establishing Cuba as a free nation. The treaty came to the United States Senate for ratification, and a close division between imperialist and anti-imperialist factions left its adoption in doubt for a few months. Finally, on February 6, 1899, it was accepted on a 57-27 vote, a 2-vote confirmation margin. The war was over. This is Our Hidden History.